raising your hand or via the chat box. Okay, go ahead, Wendy.
All right, so I am just going to dive right in. I apologize to the people that attended the meeting last week. There is a little bit of redundancy for 2 slides, but then we jump into what we found out from our interviews with maintenance and operations, so that should prove to be a little more interesting. I'm happy to take questions as we present. We do only have an hour this meeting. We do want to present goals as well. We'll introduce the goals. We want to hear from you, kind of your initial gut reaction. And then, like always, we'll post it on the webpage and you can follow up with additional comments. So here's the redundancy. Since we last met, we met with the aviation board and we asked them the same question. If this transportation plan could accomplish only one thing, what would it be? So they want it to support and maintain a reliable ferry system, because without that, it also impacts air service. Aviation in rural Alaska should focus on the basics, providing a safe and maintained runway and not a lot of bells and whistles, just because of operation, maintenance, and qualified personnel. And then we should really be cognizant throughout this plan that a traditional cost benefit analysis doesn't work for rural Alaska. We're a state of subsidies. And if we don't have those, the people in rural Alaska are really going to be adversely impacted, much more so than anyone in the urban community. So those were their initial reactions. And then next, we talked to both the Interior Tribal Coordination Group and the Governor's Tribal Advisory Group. So their comments were, there's so many needs and so many unsafe roads in rural Alaska. This plan really needs to do an inventory so they understand what's out there and help identify appropriate funding sources so they can start chipping away at that. They struggle with coming up with grant and match requirements, so looking for any innovative thinking there. And that we really need to be cognizant that all of our highways serve a dual purpose. They're community connectors, but they're also the backbone of our freight and how we get resources to market, which is really our economy. And opportunity for DOT to partner with tribes and tribal organizations. They actually have federal funding sources that they can help bring to the table and advance some of these rural projects. And finally, although many parts of Alaska are losing population, the rural hubs like Bethel are seeing an increase in population and online purchases. So when you think about that, they're really starting to rely on air to get those online purchases out to them. And so that's been a little bit of a change. So the next thing we did is we're trying to fill in that maintenance and operations piece. And so we have conducted interviews with each of the regions on maintenance and operations. And we're really looking at this at a statewide level, right? So these are the statewide trends. There's a lot of granularity in there, but we're not going to go into that. So one of the really interesting things is in 2013, we had an influx of funding and we did a lot of 1R projects. Well, guess what? They're all ready for maintenance now. And we don't really have the money to address that huge need. There's been a loss of talent. The DOT operators' wages aren't as competitive with local agencies like Fairbanks and Anchorage, for example. We're also seeing retirement, and we're not seeing as many people come into the trades. So just having the personnel is becoming more and more of a challenge. The budgets don't align with public expectations. The public has a level of service they think that they want, and there's just not enough money to provide that. Subsidence issues at airports is getting increasingly problematic, and we're DOT is having to have large stockpiles of gravel at all of these remote airports just to keep the runways open. This one was really interesting to me. Maybe you all knew it, but the Avalanche Howitzer program is nearing the end of its life nationwide. So the military provides the howitzers for avalanche control. And there's only about 10 years worth of ammunition left in the nation. And so we need to start thinking about how we're going to mitigate for avalanches in the future. And other states, Canada, are starting to respond to this, but this is kind of a real problem. And of course, like everything, the deferred maintenance backlog is growing. There's also the desire to take the last state-owned harbors and transfer those to local communities, but the local communities aren't willing to take those on until they're brought up to standards. The equipment fleet is aging, so it's almost time for a lot of new equipment. Collector and local roads, I think this is primarily Anchorage, a little bit of Fairbanks, maybe a little bit of Juneau, but they're going to be better served by local jurisdictions. But again, the local jurisdictions are strapped for money and they don't want to take those over until they've been brought up to their standards. And the last piece is they've transferred a lot of their maintenance that they could to the federal program. So that's how we can do some of the pavement preventative maintenance. But that federal money has a lot of rules with it. And the state money is what really allows for maximum flexibility. So they can really respond to those emergencies, the earthquake, the weather, just the needs. Whereas that federal money is a little more difficult to work with. So if you were really talking from a maintenance and operations standpoint, they'd like to see the money to be state money. So that is kind of the overview, what we've been doing since we last talked. Are there any questions or comments about what I reported?
Steve, you got something? No, okay, sorry. I thought I saw
You
your
looked
hand
like
going.
you wanted to say something, yeah.
I know, sorry. I didn't mean to call you out.
No, that's okay. You're not the first, you won't be the last.
Okay, any discussion or questions about what Wendy just talked about?
Is it possible to get a copy of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we will upload this to the website directly after this meeting. And then I'll send out some additional resources for you tomorrow. So just be ready for all that.
All right,
Todd, you have your hand
Todd
up.
and then Kim had their hands up.
Oh, yeah. Todd, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'll try and lower my hand while I'm talking. In reference to one of the things that was mentioned, subsidence and erosion issues at airports and whatnot from the airport group. It's something we were just having a conversation amongst my group earlier and thinking about the fact that we're updating this LRTP. And I'm wondering if there would be an opportunity to put something in there, not necessarily resiliency or actually river erosion and global warming, and to have a standard type, maybe not a standard, but at least a documentation area somewhere that says, these are some of the steps you should take when you're having or witnessing river erosion, whether it's along a state maintained road or highway or a community highway or road or even in an airport. So that's all, referencing this is the steps you should take when you're witnessing this erosion event.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Kim, we'll go to you next.
I'll be really quick. I can no longer access the website for all the materials, and so I would love to make sure that folks just send it out via email. The borough has all these security policies, so I want to be able to share the information with my team, but I can't access it. So sorry for talking about housekeeping on our limited call, but I want to remember to say it.
That's okay. You're on my list to reach out to directly to help get things out. So thank you.
And we're happy to send, it's kind of a big PowerPoint. We can PDF it. We're happy to send it out to all of you after the meeting to make it easier.
Okay, Steve, you're up.
Yeah, I'll apologize in case I missed it, but was there any discussion or any bullets regarding ports that I just failed to hear you say?
Well, I think these were, so this is a maintenance and operations interview, and DOT doesn't really maintain your ports.
No, you're right. They don't. Well, they don't maintain the harbors either. But
exactly. So no, in this particular summary, there wasn't discussion of ports.
Will there be opportunity, even though the state puts ports on ignore, as part of the freight infrastructure, that we have to include those in this?
Yes, we absolutely do. So we are actually scheduling those interviews. Steve, you're on the hit list to talk more about ports. So we're scheduling interviews as part of the freight plan right now to fill in those other blanks.
Okay, so I'll hold my thoughts till we get to that point. Thank you, Wendy.
Perfect, thank you.
The other thing, Steve, is that the information that you provided to me,
Yes.
that is going to make it into the Freight Advisory Committee meeting summary. We haven't distributed that yet, but look for the bullets you gave me in the Freight Advisory Committee summary.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Aves.
Yes, in the interviews, there was a comment that said the equipment fleet is aging.
Mhm.
I thought the equipment fleet was kind of a pay-as-you-go sort of, you get the vehicle and then you begin to pay a fee, a monthly fee to build up a replacement account. I mean, is that system failing?
I think what we're seeing, based on the interviews, there's concern that there's more and more needs and less money. And as emergencies arise, they're having to dip into some of those contingency funds to address those. So they're doing their best to keep that balanced, but having to kind of fight fires a little bit as they go. And we are preparing the financial analysis, so we'll have a little more detail on how all of that is looking in our next meeting.
I
Okay,
can
thank
provide
you.
additional guidance on that for you, Aves, if you'd like. This is Todd Van Hove.
Oh, hi, Todd.
Yeah. So, yes, you're absolutely correct. However, when state M&O gets their budgets, they're only funded at somewhere between 85 and 90% of their actual equipment costs. And so there is always a shortage. And so they don't, so those payments that they make while they're making those payments during the year don't necessarily add up to a replacement cost when the equipment's actually ready to be replaced. So then they extend the age on some and they look for other monies and they do a myriad of different things of trying to figure out how to replace that equipment.
Thank you, Todd.
Okay, we're going to go to Nils. Go ahead, Nils.
Yeah, thanks. I was just looking, I think it was the last slide, struck me, lots of potential conversations about that relationship between the state and local governments, about who pays for what and how. Clearly for that first bullet, that's related to kind of historic mistrust about that transfer, and then the corresponding follow-up on commitments made to funding for those harbors. And I think on the third point, if local roads are better served by local jurisdictions and state money allows for a lot of flexibility, then closing the gap between those points would be important as part of kind of future conversations.
Yeah, I think we'll be talking about those a lot more as we move forward.
Okay.
Not easy to solve.
Okay, so now, I guess I just want to say I understand it's difficult to jump into goals discussions, especially with a large group of people like this. So I want everybody to just, like, I don't know, shake yourself off a little bit, transition into operating at a 20,000 foot level for the rest of the meeting, to start talking about the draft goals in the plan. So keep in mind, we have to start somewhere. And the cool thing about what we're going to look at today is when we usually start somewhere, it's usually like somebody like me or like Wendy putting something out there to start from. But actually what we're starting from today is a lot of DOT thought and energy into some draft goals. So what we're looking at now is a combination of everything we've heard so far, in addition to kind of rolling in some of the goals from the last plan, the last long range transportation plan update. So this is the first stab, and we want to start talking these through with you. These are going to get a lot of time and attention and input over the next series of weeks. So just know that this is the first time we're doing this. You get the first look. Okay, already there are starting to emerge 6 strategic focus areas. So before we dive into the details of what the goals are in each of the strategic focus areas, I just want to talk about those 6 things. Investment decision-making. How does DOT invest resources statewide? The Alaskan economy. How does it fit within everything that's going on throughout the state? An internal look, DOT itself as an agency. Externally, Alaskan people, all of us, the service, who receives the service, right? Funding and finance, and then how everything might fit within the transportation industry as a whole. Okay, so these are the 6 areas where things are starting to fall to begin with.
Yeah, so we're going to organize, the goals are organized under each of these categories.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to really re-emphasize, this is an iterative process. So we still have the public survey coming out. We're still meeting with all of you. We're simply introducing these right now. And then your input is also going to help shape and refine them. So these are not final and they are not perfect. And I know Holly said that, and we'll probably say it 3 more times. But sometimes it's easier to respond to something than it is to just say, hey, what should the goals be?
So I guess before we dive in, because these are the details we're going to get into. There's a little sneak peek, right? I guess before we dive into the details, are there any maybe like overarching categories that you think maybe haven't been addressed? Or do you have any feedback right now? Steve, your hand's up. Go first. And you might be on mute if you're trying to talk to us.
And you're right, I was. I'm going to buy one of those "You're on mute" T-shirts. And this may get answered when you go into the detail on these, but I was thinking as I looked at the last bullet there, maybe it's the transportation industry and supply chain sustainment ought to be mentioned somewhere in one of these if it isn't already embedded in what you've got for any of these bullets.
So yeah, so as a strategic focus area, you're looking a little more towards that freight component being a strategic investment area and called out.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. And I'm just going to give you a gold star, Steve, because that's exactly the kind of feedback we're looking for. So thank you for getting us started off on the right foot.
You're welcome.
Okay. Anyone else? First comment maybe on these high-level strategic focus areas. We can come back to this because, again, this is iterative. So I'm just going to dive in with some of the details.
It just
go ahead.
It just seems like the investment decision making should come by the economy, the people, and it seems like that's an offshoot of something, not in itself. I mean, we need to have that lined out, but it seems like it is a byproduct of some of these other things.
Okay.
So just to build on that, this is Nils. Did I understand that right to be how DOT makes investment decisions? And I guess, the emphasis on DOT here surprised me, like instead of it being statewide, or it seems like investment decisions would be coming from appropriations, and that's a different level of decision making than DOT. So I've got maybe questions about where DOT fits into how we focus on different elements of a strategic plan beyond implementing it.
So I think just before we even go into the goals, that's a really good question. So DOT gets their federal funds, and those have a lot of rules and strings attached. And that's an appropriation and allocation. DOT doesn't have a ton of control over that. And then they get their state funds from the legislature. So they get this pot of money. How do they invest that pot of money into accomplishing everything that's in their mission? So I think it'll come as we look at goals. So that's kind of where it's at, because remember, this is a statewide long-range transportation plan. We can't change the state of Alaska through this plan.
Okay, Nicholas, go ahead.
Yeah, I see kind of 3 groupings in here that help me understand a bit more of the focus. It's the agency, how the agency organizes itself, who they serve, and what the agency actually does. So it's very agency centric, and that's fine. But thinking about it that way, of who they serve and who they're connected to. You have Alaskan people and you have transportation industry. What's not necessarily included in there is the other governments in Alaska, say your MPO local agencies or your federal land management agencies. So there's the intergovernmental aspect that I don't think is necessarily captured here.
So we can kind of capture that as planning partners right now.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, collaboration with planning partners, something like that. Does that capture the spirit of what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's jump into goals because it's going to help add a little definition to what those are. And I'm sure you'll all have plenty to say, which actually makes me very happy because if you're not participating, then I worry.
Okay, I'm gonna read them because then you can think about them as I read them. Investment decision-making focus. Okay. Prioritize the investment into resources at DOT, Division of Program Development and Statewide Planning, to focus on data science, analytics, and informatics to implement, improve, and maximize data-driven, evidence-based investment decision-making. Okay.
And a little bit of context, that's a whopper. A little bit of context on this is DOT is required to continue to obtain federal funding to report back on certain performance measures. And big data is becoming a business, and it's becoming more and more how all DOTs are making their decisions. And it's also a little more defensible. It's harder for someone to argue with facts than opinion. So that's just a high level background on that one.
Okay, we'll get through all of them and then we'll dive in. Prioritize investments in safety, system preservation, and modernization based on their impact through performance-based planning and programming to categorize, prioritize, and select infrastructure investments. Okay. Monitor transportation system performance, condition, and safety measures to maintain the good and improve the bad. So using data to understand what's happening and make improvements or changes. Last one, research, analyze, and identify the best mode, intramodal, intermodal, or multimodal solution for prevailing transportation problems and solving them with contemporary solutions through investment decision-making. Okay, let those stew. And does anybody have any questions or comments on specific goals grouped in the investment decision-making focus area?
And I think, as an initial reaction, do any of them look way off base? Could they use some wordsmithing for a little bit to make them a little more accessible? Yeah, probably.
I guess my question is, do those, go ahead, Robert, and then I'll ask my question. Go ahead.
So I'm curious, where's the prioritization for strategic partnerships to leverage the funds they have so their investments are truly maximized?
Okay, perfect.
I see a lot of money being spent here and I don't see a lot of transportation. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's what we're looking for.
I guess this is Nils again. Sorry, I don't know better than to say things. So if somebody wants to correct me in the chat bar, feel free. I guess a couple, like as you were presenting this slide again, it kind of came back to federal funding, and I struggle with that. Right? Should funding drive our strategic plan and vision? Is our investment decision, are our investment decisions solely driven by federal funding? And like, if that's the case, then what's the purpose of a long-range transportation plan beyond kind of fitting into a federal model? I don't. It doesn't feel like any of these really represent, like, here's how Alaska wants to make decisions, including if they're different than how funders might approach those. That's what I would offer.
Okay. Thanks, Nils. Wendy, do you want to address that, or do you want to let the conversation continue to go?
I think we I think we document it and then we respond with revised goals. I think
Okay.
they're good comments. So Jackson?
Yeah, I just wanted to make note. I mean, when I read these statements here on the screen, they all seem very very objective, but we all understand that things get subjective in these investment decision-making efforts. And, you know, some words, fair share, spreading the money around, you know, when I read these bullets, it sounds like if we're doing everything based on the data, volume of traffic, et cetera, I mean, all the money that comes into the state would be pumped into Anchorage. And of course, there's a lot of needs around the state and in a lot of different rural communities, et cetera. So it just seems like there should be some language in here to describe the subjectivity of spreading the investment throughout the state, despite, you know, what the data shows there. So not sure how to quite capture that, but some you know, maybe the word equity or something is included somewhere.
Kind of goes back to that traditional cost benefit analysis doesn't particularly work in Alaska. Thanks, Jackson. Brian?
I guess I'm having a hard time understanding how we're going to strategically identify this from a planning perspective, under the presumption that this is not fiscally constrained. And in my experience, you know, it's great to have these strategic plans and say, we're going to do this, 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 but you only got enough money to do one of them. And moreover, oftentimes when money becomes available, it either comes with strings attached, or to actually put it where you need it is so incredibly difficult that you just don't wind up putting it there. And so I'm really kind of at a loss. You know, if you look at the port infrastructure as an example, and I include our port facilities in that, I'm not just picking on poor Steve over there, you know, those things were all built 60 years ago, plus or minus. His right before the earthquake and ours right after the earthquake. And it's going to take a hell of a lot of money to go in and fix them. And unfortunately, not only is the money not readily available, but the amount of time it's going to take to actually bring them to construction, there's a continuity concern as far as, are you going to fix it before or after it falls in the water? And, you know, that mode of transportation is not alone. We have aging bridges. DOT has aging bridges. We have, you know, the Turnagain Arms, a prime example of, you know, there's lots of opportunities there to bring that highway up to current design standards and hopefully reduce some of the accidents and so forth down there, as well as provide access for other users. But, you know, I sat in a meeting yesterday. They've been working on something for 17 years and they just gave up and are going back into scoping because of the environmental crap and all the other stuff. And it's still going to be hundreds of millions of dollars that will suck the entire room out of a capital budget. So how are we going to get past that in this plan?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Well, it's unfortunately not just a single billion. There's a couple $1 billion laying around out there. I could spend $1 billion tomorrow just on our infrastructure to pretty much cover up the deferred maintenance after 50 years of federal ownership.
All right.
Okay. Yeah. Any other comments on this slide before we move on? We can come back. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, Alaskan economy focus. Monitor economic development activities and trends so that the resulting demands for transportation infrastructure investments are prioritized and support the economy. Encourage engagement with local officials, municipalities, and small businesses to improve access, to maintain access to businesses where possible, improve access where prudent, for the end result of spurring measurable economic growth. Okay, first reactions here. Does this mean something specific to anyone?
Well, does this mean something specific to DOT? How are they going to do that?
So
Judy, we'll let you go first. Go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it might be easier just to say that DOT should engage with local officials to ensure that necessary transportation projects have a meaningful impact on the local and state economy or something along those lines. Because I think all of them do, but I think the important part here is engaging with the local officials and governments to make sure that everyone is, kind of in the same mindset about the import and the benefit of the project. I think all of our projects probably will do this, but maybe we could go further with that coordination and, discussion about how that might be met. But it almost seems like this is a little bit wordy for what we're really trying to get at, in my opinion.
And some of the actions, this kind of seems to jump into goals and actions, so we could probably break it up a little bit. Thanks.
Nicholas, you go. You next, and Steve after Nick.
Sure. Quick point. I do go by Cole, but it can't be. I don't know how to update that on Teams. So both of these suggest, and again, this is probably taking the agency approach to it. So these are like the agency's activities. So the agency here is monitoring, and the agency is encouraging someone to engage. I think it's the first one I can get on board with, that their role is just tracking what the economy is doing and then planning accordingly. But the second one, it seems like you could strike encourage and just be what their actual goal is, to engage with local officials and so on. You can't, at the end of the day, all you're measuring is the encouragement. It's not really a benefit, whereas the actual engagement is what you're after. So you can just say engage with local officials and so on.
Great, cool, thanks. I called you everything except Cole. Okay,
it's not. Yeah, it's not very intuitive. I do not hold it against you.
All right, go ahead, Steve.
No, I was just going to say, as I read these, I can say that this is stuff that we do independently and on our own. But I don't think there is a statewide concerted effort or nobody is doing this synergistically. Everybody's doing it on their own because their own survival is at stake. There ought to be some responsibility, on the part of state DOT or Department of Commerce or somebody to at least try to pull everybody together on these things, because there's potential opportunity out there, particularly on the resource development side of things. We don't manufacture and export anything. It would be wonderful if we ever did that. And this would be a heck of a lot easier to get our arms around, because that's pretty tangible and simple. But some of these other things have very long lead times on them. And when the individuals that are involved in trying to make a success of that are on their own seeking, the transportation industry support, absent anybody else knowing it's happening, you tend to lose out on what the whole system as a whole could provide in the way of support for something like this. So that's a lot of words, and I don't have a clue how to get that succinctly put down as something here, but maybe that's what a strategic plan is supposed to do. Try to pin the rose on somebody at the state level to take the lead, to control everything that people are doing to ensure their own survival, absent thinking of it as a systems kind of approach requirement.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. So if we remember, this is a performance-based plan, so we have kind of these big lofty goals. They're a little hard to measure. But under these goals, we're going to have specific actions and we're going to have a metric that DOT can say, how are we doing? We're going to say, you're going to meet, 5 times as a leader to bring these agencies together. How are you doing? And so we are going to bring that down to making sure that these things can be measured. All right, we can take a couple more comments, but I do want to be cognizant of time. We have a lot more to get through. So let's get through these comments and then we'll move on to the next one.
Nils, Connor, and Robert, and then we'll move on. Okay, go ahead, Nils.
Yeah, just really quickly, I'm worried that how it's framed right now is more focused on project equals growth versus project brings down the cost of doing business and living in Alaska. And I think that's a key part of economic development that's lost in here. And I did put a chart in the chat bar too. And Alaska hasn't kept pace with inflation for 20 years in terms of GDP growth. So, I mean, where is DOT, where is transportation infrastructure going to contribute to GDP growth that's more than 1.11% a year? That'd be my bit.
Okay.
Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, and this may kind of echoes somewhat of Neil's sentiment there, and it largely relates to, when it comes to infrastructure investment, I think people get really caught up in kind of the big new shiny things, right? That tend to move the dial. But what's important to note is that these big new shiny things, what do they rely on in terms of the existing infrastructure? And because it's infrastructure is an interesting animal in that, right? If you do everything right, nothing happens. And then it's only when things, there's deferrals of maintenance and things like that. And incidents happen and, people get injured or what happened or roads are closed that people kind of cry foul. And so just trying to, relay that and make sure that we're looking at these, the very kind of basics which allow for these other projects to function, continue to function, and we're allocating sufficient resources to ensure that they operate into the future. So we're not kind of recklessly expanding our maintenance cost base.
Go ahead, Robert.
All right, thanks. I like the idea of the economic focus and the engagement, but for the most part here, is they're talking to themselves and their subdivisions, political subdivisions. I would replace the word small businesses with ARDers and EDOs. All across the state, we have Alaska recognized regional economic development organizations that track the metrics of economic development, that understand the importance and the link between transportation and economic development. And in a couple of regions where there might not be an ARDer, there's a Chamber of Commerce, another EDO, economic development organization, that should weigh in. Those are the metrics and people that DOT should be talking about when they're proposing transportation linkages.
Okay, perfect. Cool. I like that focus on metrics. Thank you. All right, Holly, let's get to the next one because we have a lot to go through.
Okay. DOT agency focus. Maximize DOT's efficiency and effectiveness through streamlined project delivery that has targets with acceptable and unacceptable thresholds for delivery, is transparent and manageable. Create and maintain transparency into the STIP and the Airport Improvement Program and all plans in the family of plans that allows for clear understanding of how scarce resources are allocated. Okay. The inward look a little bit. Any reactions?
All right, let's go to the next one.
Alaskan people focus. Incorporate livability, community, and environmental concerns into our decisions. Monitor and improve transportation resiliency to address safety and security risks. Address changes in travel demand throughout the state, increases and decreases, and reflect those changes in corridor and area plans that are updated within 5 years of this plan. Okay, we'll go to Cole first and then Jackson.
Yeah, this actually might be where you would plug in the intergovernmental aspect, because this is really the outward looking goal of how the DOT does their work in relationship to public and private partners. So this might be where you would plug that in.
I like that word outward facing. That was
Okay.
good. Good capture on it.
Go ahead, Jackson.
Yeah, so this comment applies to both this one and the previous one. I think one of the, I guess, biggest deficiencies here in, say, the STIP development process is the lack of public engagement in developing the STIP and developing the amendments to the STIP. So for both of these here, I think somewhere there should be a goal that DOT significantly overhauls their public involvement in developing their plans and programs and investment strategies. So we need to hear from the Alaskan people what their needs and wants are, and DOT should respond to that input into their everyday operations.
Good, and we hope you'll help us get this public survey out, Jackson, and everyone else. First plug. All right, one more, then we should go on. We still got a couple more to get through.
Okay, Cole, go ahead.
Yeah, to respond to that last point, something we want to focus on there is not the overhaul, because you can overhaul something and still have it be bad. It's really focusing on what does valuable public involvement look like in the Alaskan context. That's what you want to memorialize in here. And if it's not going poorly, focusing on, well, what's not working, what should it look like? So that's the part we really want to plug in, not so much that whether you overhaul it or not.
Cool, thank you. Okay, funding and finance focus. Prioritize the research into alternative funding sources and invest in resources that aim to improve funding sources for the state. Okay, encourage the research and recommendation of a replacement to the motor fuel excise tax with options such as a user-based fee or road user charge to fund the transportation system.
This one ought to generate some comments.
I know, I'm like, why are there no hands? Okay, Cole, you get to go first, but somebody else gets to chime in afterwards. Go ahead,
On
Cole.
both of these, couldn't you strike prioritize the and encourage the and just be research these and research and recommend that? Well, I don't understand why you have to prioritize and encourage.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay, 2 for that vote. Brian?
Go ahead, Brian.
I don't necessarily see as the road system the only one that needs to look at these sorts of user fees. And so is there a way to maybe make that more broadly based, whether that's on the maritime side, the air side, or what have you?
Yeah, that's a good point, Brian.
Yeah, I think the Anchorage Airport does okay and Fairbanks does okay, but if you get out to the villages, I'm not sure exactly how those are funded and maintained.
Yep, so a little bit broader based.
Mm-hmm.
Aves?
It would seem to me that we probably should research user type fees for alternative fuel vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
In my view, there's no need to scrap the fuel tax system that exists today. With the advent of vehicle miles traveled, for example, you'd have to create a whole bureaucracy to collect that money. In terms of the fuel tax, all you need to do is change a number in the statute. And there's a very efficient motor fuel tax system in place where the distributor collects the tax for the state. It's relatively low cost, and rather than focus on replacing the motor fuel user fee tax with an alternative view, it would be short-sighted in my view, and rather focus on how we can encourage those who are operating alternative fuel vehicles to pay their share.
Thanks, Aves. Okay, go ahead, Nils.
Yeah, for the first one, aim to improve funding sources for the state. Like, that's not our goal. Our goal is to improve transportation. And I don't know that we should give the state kind of unrestricted carte blanche to new money. Let's be really specific about what we hope that new funding or improved funding sources aim to achieve, and how they do that equitably and in ways that are meaningful and consistent with the plan.
Okay.
Okay, I think this is the last one. Yep, transportation industry. Create an electric vehicle, autonomous vehicle, and alternative fuel corridor plan to add to the family of plans, addressing the short, intermediate, and long-term needs, requirements, and objectives for these areas as an adjunct to the Alaska transportation system. Monitor national trends for situational awareness. Trends that have the potential to impact Alaska will be factored into investment decision making.
And aviation people should jump in on this because there's a lot happening in aviation with the unmanned aerial system. So we should update that first one to be a little more inclusive to what the other modes are doing as well. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Cole?
Go ahead, Cole.
So the second one is extremely broad. I assume it's actually you're referring to national trends for new and emerging technology or something like that. Because you could, I mean, national trends for situational awareness could be anything. It could be demographic. It could be all kinds of things. But I assume we're talking more about let's say like technology and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I think we could be more specific with emerging tech.
Anyone else? Okay.
So Holly, before we move on, because we're kind of moving on to what's next, do you feel like with the conversation we had today that the overarching goals are pretty well captured if we kind of modify based on everything we heard today? Do you feel like there's anything really missing? I didn't hear anything that was egregious that you said absolutely take out. Are we pretty close? Oh boy, that got a lot of comments.
Okay, we'll go to Jackson first. Go ahead, Jackson.
Well, yeah, I mean, the beginning of this presentation, talked about the results of the interviews with maintenance personnel and whatnot. And I guess I didn't really see, and maybe I missed it, but I didn't really see any goals here focused in on our major issue with the lack of maintenance funding and level of service for maintenance. It seems like one of the goals of the plan should be to address the maintenance backlog issues and annual maintenance funding.
Perfect. So take care of what we have. I think Katie was next, and we haven't heard from Katie.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Katie.
Can you guys hear me? I have a little
Yes.
audio. Okay, excellent. I guess I'd like to piggyback on take care of what we've got, because as a public works director, when I work with a governing body on funding, that's a question I'm always asking them. Do you want to invest in shiny new things or taking care of what we have? And that's a major philosophical underpinning of a plan. And that doesn't just mean funding maintenance and operations. That means funding rehabilitation projects and funding new bridges. I mean, this is taking care of what we have is a billions and billions of dollars. So I do think that conversation of like, is our first priority taking care of what we have and our second priority building new things to increase economic development, or vice versa, or are they both just as important, would be an important starting place.
Well summarized. Thank you.
Go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, just real quick, I totally agree with those last two comments, particularly maintenance and taking care of what you got. I don't want to forget the communities that haven't been, that may desire to be road connected and for various reasons have not been able to be road connected in the past, I don't know, 70 years or 80 years since the airplanes came into being. We just did the Northwest Alaska Transportation Plan, one of the area plans, and there was a lot of interest in those areas, Northwest Alaska, of trying to get some kind of connection for freight and for cheaper transportation. So I don't know where in the goals, but it seems like we need to recognize that we're still a developing state. We're not completely built out. and leave some room for community connections. It may not be DOT's #1 focus, totally get that, but it is something that Alaska needs to kind of reckon with.
Excellent, thank you.
Nils.
I would just say, I mean, I think along the way I was trying to think of how does this focus area help us make a different kind of decision or make a decision generally? And I don't know that I really felt directed or guided in as it relates to decision making. There aren't good filters for changing how we might do something along the way. So I don't know what that means. I mean, I think my kind of takeaway from overall the focus areas was kind of a shrug. Like, it's probably fine. There's lots of, I mean, yes, wordsmithing to do, and it'll be okay. But it also didn't really inspire me to think about here's where we're headed as a state.
Okay. I think that'll be a little clearer when we start doing some actions and get down. So yeah, that meeting that'll be a spicy meeting.
Go ahead, Cole.
One possible gap here, and it might be for a later meeting, is I think is leaving no money on the table. So not just finding new forms of money and alternative forms of ways to maintain the system, but leveraging those funds for other funding opportunities such as federal grants, that sort of thing, and also ensuring that that the state has the match available for these funding opportunities as they come. So you're not leaving any money on the table. It's using the money you have the most effectively, and I think that's a different conversation than just finding other ways to generate money. I think that's one that might not be here. It might be more of a strategy later on, but I would caution against skipping that.
Yeah, and we did have a comment in the chat box about grant money and making the most of that as well. Okay.
Okay, Aves.
Quickly, are there any federal regulations or requirements on the composition of the plan, of this long-range transportation plan?
Yes, there are.
Are we meeting those requirements? Are we flirting with them, or?
We will be meeting them by the time we're done. So we have a very specific checklist. For example, one of the requirements is engagement with planning partners. And then, so the freight plan will have specific federal requirements, as does the long-range transportation plan. And those are summarized on the website. We can send those out individually, but we do have a checklist. We do have certain requirements we have to meet.
Thank you.
Okay. You want to move along, Wendy?
Yeah, so I think what's next is the public outreach event is officially live, correct, Holly?
It's live.
It's live. So this is where we really need all of you. The survey is live. It's on the website. Again, we really want to push that survey out. It's pretty easy to get people in Anchorage and Fairbanks to respond, but any listservs you have to rural Alaska, we want to think about Kodiak, we want to think about Ketchikan, we want to think about Prince of Wales Island, we want to think about Bethel and Kotzebue. So anything you can do to help push that survey out would be wonderful. It's going to be live from today through June 30th. And then we are wrapping up the financial analysis memo, and that's going to have a lot of meat in it. So we're still on schedule to deliver in August of 2022. We're not really going to see you again until probably late August and September because it is fishing season. So we have a lot of work to do. The next meeting will probably be a joint meeting of the STAC and FAC. We'll come back to you with survey results, the financial report, and modified goals and objectives. And then we're quickly going to move into scenario planning. So that's going to help us understand what are the priorities and what are the trade-offs. So a lot of work will be happening in the fall.
So in addition to this presentation that has everything we presented today, I'll send out an email to all of you after this that gives you the resources that you need, that includes the virtual public meeting and the survey, so that if you have channels to push those out through, you can do that with the information that I send you today.
Yeah, we want to make it as easy as possible. We have an internal goal of we would like to see 1,000 responses to this survey from across the state. So we're really going to be beating the drum because so far virtual engagement has been really successful, and we're actually seeing a higher success rate because people can do it on their own time. But the way for it to work is to get the word out. And I think that's it.
One hand up. I have one hand up. Go ahead, Robert.
I'm just curious if you think that you can distill this into maybe a 10-15 minute overview. I might be able to get you in front of all of the arters across the state to do a pitch, and then they could push this out into each of their regions, and that would get you some maximum exposure. Maybe we could follow up with that in the next couple of days.
That would be fantastic, and we've already got a 10-minute spiel, so that's easy.
Okay.
Cool. I'll follow up with you, Robert. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate that. I can't thank you enough for the level of participation. We always worry that nobody will talk, and they were really thoughtful and great comments, and we look forward to getting these revised and bringing them back to you. So enjoy your summer, catch some fish, and we'll see you in the fall. You know how to reach us. We'll take comments at any time. If new ideas come up as you ponder these, just shoot them our way, and we'll get them incorporated.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thanks.